Hello everyone and welcome to today's stream. In search of the Trojan War Part 3, let's get started.
In our search for the Trojan War, we've constantly spoken of Homer. Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, tells the tale of the war.
I like the Iliad.
The Iliad is the beginning of European literature, and yet it's still one of the widest read books.
Here, Penguin Books are just running off the 35th printing since 1952 of their translation. That amounts to about 1 million copies of just one
yeah,
version
my translation's from
into English alone.
Arcturus.
So if Homer were still around today, he'd be a very wealthy man indeed. And the reason that he's still read is not because he's a classic, but because he's a great storyteller.
That he is.
Wonderful language, even in translation. He gives us an image of a heroic age which is so vividly realized that ever since the audience have been unable to resist the idea that in some way it's true. But is there any historical truth behind Homer's tale of Troy? Did that story go back, as so many people would love to believe, to a real event in the Bronze Age, a historical Trojan War?
Yes, a lot of people. I dare say Eric Shanour and David Gamel are two such people. Whoa, wait. Wait, is she... okay then. Well, actually, yeah, it makes sense. They didn't... the breasts were pretty much exposed. The singer
Homer
of
has
tales.
always been seen as the first and greatest poet in Western culture.
With
But
William
what
Shakespeare
connection,
being the
if
second,
any,
I'd
is there
say.
between the Greek Homer, who may have composed in the 8th century BC, and the Mycenaean bards of the 13th century BC, when the war is supposed to have taken place? The tale of Troy has been told for 2,500 years. According to the legend, an armada of 1,000 ships came from all over Greece to try to recover the Greek or Achaean queen Helen, who had eloped with Paris, Prince of Troy.
She'd been abducted. Aphrodite turned Paris, made Paris look like her
The
rightful
contingents
husband
gathered at Argos in
Menelaus.
central Greece. There their leader Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia to gain the gods' approval for the war.
Well, yeah, but
After 10
Artemis
years
then
of siege,
spirited her
the
away
city
and
was
replaced her
destroyed.
with the...
Succeeding generations
What
have
was
seen
it
the tale
specifically
as an
Was
archetypal
it a
image
steak? Was it a
of the
fawn? A
tragedy
doe? I
of
can't
war.
remember.
Homer's heroes fought with bronze weapons, but his portrayal of the common sufferings of victors and vanquished is universal. It came to mind to one man even in the western desert, General Sir John Hackett.
It's a story about the sort of people I know. Don't know where they are, what their
Indeed.
nationalities, what environment. These are fighting people, and they share a lot of the characteristics of people that I've known in circumstances which, to me, are not by any means unfamiliar.
Does this suggest to you that the facts of the story of Troy, as told by Homer, are a mere story? Or could they actually reflect military reality?
Oh, I think so. I remember outside Merson True, when there'd been a battle all day and a battle in the morning, and in this short night there we were, and German flares were going up practically all around us, and we were eating a little, talking a little, sleeping hardly at all, and waiting for the morning. Now, there's that story about how the campfires of the Achaeans and the Trojans, like stars on a still night, twinkled at each other out of the gloom while the men round and waited for the battle that would begin in the morning. And I couldn't help asking myself whether the thoughts and feelings that were in these men's hearts and minds were very different from those that on that occasion outside Mercenary I knew were in our own.
Well, what's this footage from?
A 1,000 fires burned in the plain, and beside each one were 50 men in the glare of the flames. So the Trojans stood to arms all night. Meanwhile, immortal panic, companion of cold fear, gripped the Greeks, as even their best men were stricken with stark terror. We begin with Troy itself. Archaeologists have proved there was an imposing citadel exactly where Homer's tale says, at the mouth of the Dardanelles. A royal fortress with well-built gates and towers. Finds of pottery show it had trading relations with Agamemnon's Mycenae. But that doesn't prove Homer's tale is true. Is there anything in Homer's language which can tell us whether his story actually goes back 500 years before his day?
We'll start with the text, the one we saw coming hot foot off the press. This is translated from modern printed texts, and they go back to this great book, the original printed edition of Homer's Iliad, done in Florence in 1488. What a wonderful piece of bookmaking it is.
Yes, indeed.
The Greek scholars who constructed this text used medieval manuscripts. Behind those medieval manuscripts lie Roman papyruses, preserved in fragments in the sands of Egypt. But this written tradition only takes us back about as far as 550 BC. In other words, 700 years after the Trojan War, and perhaps 200 years after Homer's own time. There's a problem then. Did Homer, whoever he was, actually write this poem? Well, the opinion in Roman times was that he didn't, and that the poem had been preserved orally for a long time before it was committed to writing. And if that's the case, then this text that we know as a book is actually the record of an oral performance about 2.5 millennia old. But the question was how to prove it. The text of Homer contains features that aren't really explicable if it was written down, and chief among them are the repetitions. The text is full of repeated lines, phrases, and even whole chunks. And among them, one special feature, and that is what we call the formulas, the descriptive tags or epithets applied to the heroes. Swift-running Achilles, Hector of the bright helmet. We can just make out one of them here on the papyrus. Dios Odysseus, brilliant Odysseus. And just higher up here, great-hearted Odysseus. An even more interesting group of epithets is applied by Homer to Troy itself, which he calls well-built, finely towered, beetling, windy, and bearing many horses. Now, has Homer made up those descriptions, or do they go back long before his time, perhaps even to before the end of the Bronze Age? To answer that, we need to know more about Homer himself.
And what do we know?
Homer's identity, however, is still a great mystery. Modern experts cannot agree whether he was one man, two, several, or even a woman. Ancients believed that he was one man, whose name mysteriously means the hostage. They thought he was blind, that he had lived just before 700 BC in Ionia, what is now the western coast of Turkey. Here, Greeks had migrated in the dark age which followed the collapse of Mycenaean civilization. It was a new world which would see the birth of Western science, medicine, and philosophy. If Homer existed, he worked as a professional singer, a bard, in royal and noble courts on these coasts. His was an oral society on the verge of literacy. The ancients assumed he had written his text. Modern scholars think that the Iliad was committed to writing in a century or so after his death, but that Homer himself was working in a fully oral tradition. But what does that mean?
Okay, now we're all reading. Still Hellas. Or Scotland, Ireland.
Kilgalligan, on the Atlantic coast of County Mayo, Ireland.
Yeah, Ireland.
Here the oral tradition has lingered on. The last performer of epics the length of the Iliad died only 40 years ago, but there are still storytellers reciting tales of heroic deeds in heroic language. They resemble Homer in their style of speech, especially in the formulas or runs, whose repeat passages, like Homer's, are highly formalized. The storyteller we have come to hear cannot read or write and speaks only Gaelic. His name is John Henry. For the last 10 summers, John's repertoire has been recorded by Dr. Seamus O'Cahoyne of University College Dublin. John has not yet run out of stories.
The Scottish was the Mashgiftari, Wood Shambo and Moor, this in Shula be Shayimu, Vishatik Swas Shalivi Rudder, with a Livi near Shitik Swas, Yagra Junagus Jamu Latio, Wood Mortal Limla Crown, with a Shak motivated a Mihosu. Ach, we find a community beige, we had a Hagus Crew, Yargus Age of Hadun. August. Love your pony, Carta 2 years to pony. Tabageri bought on one joy, he took Morton, who's getting to long home. You know, Focus away when we bought his gave. Stepal Morton or Stachari.
You couldn't just break it down for me in translation, could you, line by line? Is that a difficult thing for a storyteller to do?
It's very hard to do it, but and it's very hard to translate because there's a lot of the words don't mean anything in particular. It's alliterative. It's fully within the ancient tradition of runs.
But just to catch the flavour of it.
Well, Hoiksha got Sholta Bakojaha Bakojaha. They raised their sails. Bakojaha Bakojaha, perhaps billowing or bellying sails or something like that. Snai Fadiga Barnagram. Long threads or ropes to the tops of the masts. Cataliniation, John. 200 rowing. 12 on the steering. Sand coming up and foam going down. Splish, splash, Loppadanagus, Loppadan. Whales and seals swimming along behind.
In
English you might say the end result is that they set sail and they got there. But of course, it's much more complicated than that.
And what was it that impelled him to learn those stories?
Well, John's the man to answer that question. Think you wrote to get in the Skelty show.
We shall aim to go on scale to go. These top Jones are a scale to more friend.
Vito Santa.
We must have to go on in Shanghai. We will have all sugar every day.
Well, John says that this was the attitude of mind he always had. He was greedy for stories. And of course, He got them.
Now, no one in Kilgalligan is learning the tales from John to pass them on as he did. His only audience is the tape recorder, a sure sign that the tradition is nearing its end. Now we have no need of such guardians of the tradition. Today we recall our lists from a computer terminal, not from the memory of a bard. The idea of memorizing 200 names on an international flight would seem absurd to us. To deliver a poem the length of the Iliad is simply inconceivable.
But yes,
it
it
is
was
still
done.
possible to see such a performance. To find it, we must travel far afield.
Where are we going? To Hellas? One of the great
This is the
theaters?
barren landscape of Turkish Armenia,
Oh.
within sight of the Soviet border, over
Beautiful
1,000 miles
horses.
from Homer's wine-dark Aegean. To these lands, the Turks migrated from the Central Asian steppe in the 11th century AD, bringing their ancient traditions with them. In the town of Kars, they still survive.
What's this song? It's very good.
Like Homer, these men are professional bards. They sing and play at weddings, feasts, and funerals. They were brought up from childhood in the tuition of a master. This man, Sheriff Tashliova, was given away at 7 years because even then it was seen he had the bardic gift. He is now a master. His repertoire includes 100 tales from the Turkish medieval epic of Kurulu, many of them over an hour long. He's singing from Kurulu now. Here in Kars, the audience sat for 3 hours, as long as we might sit in a cinema, thrilled by the playing and by the pathos of the singing. Here it is still possible to feel the spell worked by a bard when he has an audience who believe in his magic. However distantly, Homer did something like this 2,500 years ago when he sang the tale of Troy. But what does such a performance tell us about the way Homer's text has come down to us?
In Homer's Odyssey, King Odysseus praises the bard Demodocus for his wonderful performance of the tale of Troy. You sing it, he says, as if you were there yourself, or as if you spoke to someone who was. And now we've been to Ireland and Turkey, we can gain some idea of how bards achieve that kind of effect. The sort of formulas, for example, that John Henry used in Mayo show the mechanism of memory and show how ancient elements can be preserved within the formulas and their rigid metrical patterns. And in Turkey, the great length of the Kurulu epic and its archaic medieval language shows how poems of this immense length can be memorized and orally transmitted by a single man, a professional. And it's interesting that both the audiences in Ireland and in Turkey view the tale teller as a professional, a specialised occupation. For Sheriff Tashliover in Kars, it's his job, quite simply. But we have to ask whether that tale actually goes back to the Bronze Age. And before we do, it's worth pointing out that there's nothing intrinsically unlikely in the idea that the Iliad could go back to an eyewitness account of a Bronze Age war. In Dark Age medieval Europe, for example, Viking kings took their professional bards, their skalds, with them on their campaigns in order to sing the old songs and to compose new ones about the deeds of kings. And these were only set down in writing many centuries later. Now, if that could happen in one heroic culture, it could have happened in Mycenaean Greece. But did it? Was there a Mycenaean bardic poem about Troy? And how were the stories transmitted over the 500 years before Homer?
Excellent question. Now, where
Such
is
questions
this
are now at the
wonderful
centre of the academic
architecture?
industry spawned by Homer. At Cambridge, Dr. John Chadwick, an expert in Bronze Age Greek, is especially interested in the problem of the transmission of the tales before Homer.
I think they are transmitted by being taught from one generation to the next. In each generation, there are people who devote themselves to learning these stories. I don't think they transmit them exactly and purely accurately. They will improve upon the story in retelling it. They may just forget what the original was, or they may quite consciously take two different stories and combine them into one. And that is the impression which one gets from Homer, except that, of course, in so doing, he has produced a masterpiece. He has not just put together separate, isolated poems. He has transformed the whole into a completely new poem. But his sources, no doubt, consisted of these orally transmitted versions of events in Mycenaean times.
And you would be prepared to accept that they contained, they also included the story of a sack of a city called Troy?
I think it's very likely, yes, there was a poem on the sack of Troy. I think that the details which Homer includes in this very likely come from a number of other sources as well, but that there was something which connected Troy with Mycenaean Greece seems to me very likely indeed.
But what was that connection?
Wonderful question.
Why did Greek tradition focus its most heroic legend and an armada of 1,000 ships on this tiny place? Can we detect when Troy became the center of the tale from clues in Homer's language itself? The description of Troy in the Iliad certainly suggests that bards of Homer's day knew what the site of the city looked like.
Homer gives us a few interesting facts about the general situation of Troy. The first one is that it's windy, very windy. And I don't think that's just a stock phrase by a poet, because anybody who's been here knows that the wind blows down from the north 12 months a year. And in the days before moisturizers, what that must have done for Helen of Troy's complexion, your guess is as good as mine. The windiness has added point because the site was an exposed high one. Homer tells us that it was beetling, towering, and that may seem to be an exaggeration, but you've got to remember that the hill was much higher than it is today. The level of the royal palace would have been well above my head. Its classical builders have cut the top away, Schliemann's excavations have pushed the side out, and you've got to imagine the hill being much more compact and steep. So this was a tall headland exposed to the blasts of wind from the north.
But that doubtless was true in Homer's own day too. Does Homer know what Troy looked like in the Bronze Age?
Yes, a wonderful question.
Here, there has been a dramatic new discovery.
Oh, yes? And what
Soil
is it?
cores taken in the play show that at the time of the Trojan War, the city stood above a great bay, which silted up during classical times. This could be reflected in Homer's description of sailing from the Dardanelles inside Ilios, and when he tells of the wide bay of the sea in front of Troy. But that was still true in Homer's time. Is there anything in his picture of the city itself which could go back to the time of the Trojan War? 3 of his phrases suggest the handing down of a genuine bardic memory of a late Bronze Age Troy. First, Homer tells of the great or sacred tower of Holy Ilios by the main gate of the city. Here, Hector's wife Andromache ran like a mad woman because she had heard the Trojans were losing. Now at the main gate of the city, there was a tower enclosing an altar and fronted by pedestals for the idols of the Trojan gods. Is Homer's great tower of Holy Ilios a genuine memory of the gate tower of Bronze Age Troy?
We can hope so.
Second, Homer says that the Greeks almost broke into Troy when 3 times the Greek hero Patroclus tried to scale the slope of Troy's towering wall, but 3 times Apollo battered him back. The walls of the historical Troy do have a distinctive angle, but in Homer's own time, they were buried in debris. The last passage concerns the fine walls of Troy, which Homer says had been built with the aid of the gods. Here he gives us an extraordinarily precise detail.
He says that at one point in the circuit, on the western side, there was one section of the wall which had not been replaced by those beautiful constructions of Apollo and Poseidon.
Oh, yeah?
That on the western side, there was a badly built, weak wall, part of the older circuit, and that was where the goddess Athena told the Greeks to attack Troy. And amazingly enough, when Wilhelm Dörpfeld was excavating the circuit of Troy 6 in 1893-4, he found that on the western side there was one section of the old circuit had not been replaced. Now, Homer cannot possibly have seen this. He was composing 500 years on when this whole section was under mounds of debris. And that suggests that he is incorporating a genuine bardic memory of this place from the Bronze Age. And that raises the question, is Homer talking about a real war?
Seems possible. Oh yeah, here
Finds
we
made
go.
by archaeologists show that the bards had handed down to Homer some genuine memories of Mycenaean warfare.
Oh, yeah.
Homer accurately describes what is clearly a Mycenaean helmet sewn with rows of boar's tusks.
Mm-hmm. Excellent work.
Though he lived in the Iron Age, everywhere in the Iliad, Homer assumes that the weapons and armor of the heroes are of bronze. In describing their swords, Homer sometimes uses the phrase silver-studded. The memory and even the expression could be Mycenaean. The bards then did hand down to Homer some genuine memories of the heavily armed Mycenaean warrior class, Bronze Age knights in armor. Historical artist Peter Connolly, an expert in ancient weaponry, has recreated the heroes of Troy with the Mycenaean war gear which might lie behind Homer's descriptions.
Well, we do have a few fragments of armour and some ideas coming from Central Europe and places like that give us some inkling of what it may have been like. There have been found 3 scales like this at Troy. If one looks at the holes along the side and here, one can see that they were stitched to either a fabric or leather garment underneath, and probably overlapping like this to cover the stitching here, so it wouldn't get cut in the actual fighting. The difficulty is to what extent did the earlier cuirasses like this, a reconstruction of the Dendra armour, have to the period we're talking about. This is a particularly interesting armour actually, because in the description of Achilles only had one weak spot, which is the back of the lower leg, or the Achilles heel. It is very interesting. This covers you right the way from the nose, right the way down to the knees, and then you've got leg guards or greaves covering the front. But if you turn it round, you can see actually at the back, the only part that is vulnerable is the back of the lower leg.
Fantastic. What about the things that Homer says about some of the heroes, like Ajax's great shield and the swords of the time?
It is possible that Ajax is an earlier legend. The great big giant in his arm with this huge shield. He may come from an earlier legend, which must also probably put Hector on an earlier legend too, because he also has this huge shield. As Homer says of Hector, when he walked away from the duel with Ajax, his shield tapped him on the heels and on the back of the neck, just because he wore it over his back on a strap going down the neck. And as he walked, he would tap his neck and tap his heels. The perfect example is the most revolutionary of weapons to come. This was an entirely new type of weapon. It's a slashing weapon. This is the sort of thing, as Homer says, could cut off a man's arm.
So this is the pitiless
The
bronze.
weight is up here,
Yeah.
and it's a lashing weapon like that.
And this was introduced at that time, around the period
Yes,
of the
it's
Trojan
coming
War.
into Greece. We're finding them in
Yeah.
Greece. We find a lot of them in Central Europe, but they're coming into Greece about this time. They're also developing this, which is a sort of mixture of the early Mycenaean types for the handling, for the fixing of the handle, but also has a lot of characteristics of this. Again, it's a very small weapon, but it's again a hacking weapon. It's like a butcher's cleaver. You can again imagine somebody having his shoulder cut off.
Yeah, here we go.
The Iliad then has many layers, some even older than the Trojan War, but some tiny trace elements seem to go back to a Mycenaean war poem. So is it possible to say whether that poem was about a specific war? That is, a war fought by Greeks in the plain of Troy. At the Dardanelles, wars have been fought from prehistory to our own times. The irony was not lost on those Homer lovers who died in sight of Troy in 1915. They say Achilles in the darkness stirred, and Priam and his 50 sons wake all amazed, and hear the guns and shake for Troy again. This is Cape Helles by the Dardanelles, opposite Troy. Here stands the monument to the 36,000 men of what was the British Empire, who died in 1915 in as futile a war as Troy itself. Gallipoli. Round the monument are lists of regiments drawn from every part of the Empire: Assam, New Zealand, Ireland, Lancashire, men who no doubt died as fearfully as the heroes on the other shore.
Now, just imagine for a moment that all the written records of our own civilization were destroyed in some inconceivable catastrophe. And that in about 3,000 or 4,000 years' time, archaeologists came to this spot and uncovered the foundations of this structure. And if they dug around it, perhaps they might come across fragments of some of the lists of names, with a Singe from Burma, a Joyce from Dublin, a Wood from Manchester. But I wonder whether, from those simple facts, without any written record, they could guess the story of Gallipoli, the story of that fruitless venture by an imperial power which had once extended across the whole world, coming to this windswept and forlorn spot. The story of Gallipoli, if it had only survived in legend, would never have been believed. And yet it is a real war, and this is a real record of that war.
But what form would such a record have taken in a prehistoric oral society? And did the bards ever have such a record for the Trojan War? Amazingly enough, something like it was preserved by Homer himself.
Oh, yes?
In the Iliad, there is a strange list of 164 places. Homer says these provided the troops for the 1,000 ships which went to Troy. It claims to be the actual roll call of the Greek expedition. It's known as the catalogue of ships, but what is it? An authentic Bronze Age war record handed down by the bards? Or a later fiction?
Could be a bit of both.
Geoffrey Kirk, formerly Regius Professor of Greek at Cambridge.
Many of the places mentioned were known in the Mycenaean age and ceased to be of any importance whatever afterwards. It's obviously based on perhaps a poem, perhaps a prose listing of the ships as they assembled at Aulis to go over the Aegean to Troy.
Could you bear to let me hear some of it?
Yes.
We have the
Let's hear some.
Mori open at the entry of Argos and Mycenae, both of which are interesting. Hoide Argosiechon Tilgunthatit Tekio Esan, Hermione Asinente Bethion Catacolpon Ecusas, Troize Eanasti, Kayan Palawente Dauron, Hoitechon Aiginan, Mansitete, Kakuroi Kayon, Tondiav Hegemon Debay Nagathostionades, of them Diomedes, good at the war cry, was leader. And then he goes on to say that yes, with them there came 80 black ships, Toisid, Ogdo, Conta, Melini, Neas, Eponto. I think myself that it's got a good deal of Mycenaean content, but it also certainly has some Dark Age content. Like everything in Homer, it's a mixture of the very archaic, i.e. the Mycenaean, and the contemporary with the Trojan War, the views of Homer's own time in the 8th century BC and shortly before that, and the whole period in between those two extremities.
The problem is detecting which bit's which.
Exactly.
And that, for Homer lovers, is the $64,000 question. There's only one way to find the answer. Go and look.
Wish I had $64,000. And maybe I could pay off some stuff.
Agamemnon's capital, golden Mycenae. Any bard worth his salt would have heard of this and the other major sites named in the catalogue. Their legends were famous. Their cyclopean walls still stood. But it is the obscure sites, often completely forgotten in later times, which offer us the hope of proving at least part of the catalogue goes back to the Bronze Age. The search takes you far off the beaten track. Take the delightfully named Thisbe of the Many Pigeons, which Homer says was one of 60 places in central Greece which sent their men to Troy in 50 lash ships.
I hope that wasn't the name of it in the Iliad. At least not in my translation.
Of the pigeons and the name. There's still a Thisbe in central Greece. Like most of the catalogue sites, it's not in the tourist guides, so it's best to ask the locals for guidance. After all, if Homer's right, these could even be the descendants of the men who went to Troy. The trouble is, there's so much history to choose from that the Bronze Age is not what immediately springs to mind.
Αυτό?
Αυτό ήταν παρά να πούμε κλεισμένο με πέτρες μεγάλες.
Ναι. Αυτό είναι κλασικό?
Ναι, είναι πιο πέρα από πύργους, είναι πιο πέρα.
That regular squared masonry is the classical city. What we want is 1,000 years early.
Πού είναι ο χώρος Μικηναϊκός? Παλιοκάστρο.
There it is. There had even been a Mycenaean tomb treasure plundered here long ago. It's now part of local folklore. On top, typical Cyclopean walls and a scatter of Mycenaean pottery. Thisbe of the Many Pigeons was real enough. One up to Homer. Pity about the pigeons. At Thisbe, I learned my first lesson. Never underestimate Homer.
Yeah, the pigeons are definitely there.
Dawn in the Euphrates estuary on the south coast of Menelaus' kingdom of Sparta. Somewhere here, says the catalogue, lay the seaward city of Hellas, which sent men to Troy in the 60 ships of the Spartan contingent. Now the plain hereabouts is still called Hellas, but the search is complicated by the fact that the sea has receded some miles. After the pigeons of Thisbe, however, the past, even the Bronze Age past, had started to come alive.
How?
As you approach it through this flat country with these reeds and marshes, the bumpy road, the seabirds, to imagine Paris himself, perhaps, approaching it by sea, because this was the main Mycenaean port of the Gulf of Hellas. As you approach it, you can see this little limestone cliff rising above the plain about 70 or 80 feet, what was in fact a low promontory in Mycenaean times. It's called Agios Stephanos.
There was a little city on that limestone bluff, under an impenetrable tangle of thorns. But why here, when there is nothing today? An abandoned Bronze Age quarry behind the site shows why. Agios Stephanos was the export point for this mottled greenish stone, found only here, which was much coveted by Bronze Age kings. It is the only possible site for Homer's seaward city of Hellas. Homer's catalogue of ships says that Agamemnon took troops to Troy not only from mainland Greece, but from many islands, including Crete.
That's true.
And in the 80 Cretan ships, there were men from an obscure little place called Rhytia. Here we have no clues, only the name, perhaps partly preserved in today's village name, Rotasi. Here, there is an unexcavated Acropolis-like hill with a scatter of pottery sherds going back deep into prehistory. The locals must think I'm crazy. I hope he doesn't ask me where I'm going. He won't believe a town in Homer.
Polis Omeru.
So Homer's world is still alive after all. The search for Homer's catalogue takes you to many such forgotten corners of the Greek landscape. My journey led me to over 40. Half of the 164 names have so far been identified, and all those examined have shown traces of Mycenaean occupation. Most important, some were abandoned after the fall of the Mycenaean world and never lived in again until after Homer's day. Proof that at least some of the catalogue does go back to the Bronze Age. Exactly why the catalogue was compiled, we may never know for sure, but it remains possible that it is connected with a real event. And that brings us back to the first line of the catalogue and Homer's rocky Aulis. This was where the legend said the Greek armada assembled for Troy. Here Agamemnon sacrificed his daughter Iphigenia, Ephianassa, as Homer calls her, to get a fair wind.
And
Gave her
also
the goddess Artemis, as was later believed, where the classical sanctuary of Artemis stood. Its ruins are visible today, in the shadow of an immense cement factory. Over the railway, you enter a strange, deserted valley, barren and sinister. Almost a taboo place. Bronze Age Aulis stood looking over the famous straits where the tides come together. Here, it was said, the Greek fleet had anchored. Above the little bay is a rocky Acropolis, where the familiar broken sherds of Mycenaean pottery have been found. Although all is now blanketed by concrete dust.
Chamber tombs of Mycenaean period were found down there when the concrete works was being built, and there's also traces of Mycenaean settlement in the low ground around the sanctuary. So this part of the catalogue and the story does fit with archaeology. And if the Greek chiefs did indeed meet here in Mycenaean Aulis before they set sail, then it may have been on this Acropolis that they held their last night celebrations, although those celebrations blood-dimmed by the events which took place down there in the sanctuary of Artemis.
On the sacrifice of Iphigenia, Homer is silent. Later Greek tradition gives us the detail. In Aulis they waited while the winds brought costly delay. Hulls and cables rotting, wasting away the flower of the Greeks. Then the army prophet came up with a solution. The winds could be changed by an offering to the gods, the blood of a girl. Her prayers, her cries of father, and her virgin youth counted for nothing with the generals. Her father prayed and told them to hold her like a young goat above the altar, to bind her mouth to gag the sound which might be a curse upon her royal house. Agamemnon brought himself to sacrifice his daughter, to sponsor a war for a faithless woman.
An abducted woman. That had to be him to do it.
Did it really happen? The sacrifice sounds like a fairy tale. When we know more about the Bronze Age, we may be able to say whether, like so much of Homer's story, it has a darker truth. In conclusion, Homer stands at the end of an oral tradition which must take the story far back before him. It took generations of bards to refine the language in which he tells the tale. And inextricably embedded in that language, with all its elaborate range of formulas, is Troy itself.
Seems to me, then, that there's very good reason to think that the expedition against Troy is the fundamental and central fact of the story and must go back to the Bronze Age. You can deny that the Trojan War ever took place, but then you have no historical or archaeological peg to explain the creation of a fictional tale of Troy, centering on the hill called Hisarlik at any time in between the end of the Bronze Age and Homer's own day, the 8th century BC. And to me, that is a fatal objection to those who would deny the Trojan War ever took place. An overgrown and deserted ruin in a sparsely populated corner of northwestern Anatolia is hardly likely to be picked out as the scene of the Greeks' national epic, unless at some point in the past it really has been the focus of warlike deeds so memorable that ever after they were celebrated by the bards in song.
Was it so hard, Achilles, so very hard to die? Thou knowest, and I know not, so much the happier I.
Well, part 4 on Thursday. Thank you for joining. If you watched, my GoFundMe's down below if you want to make a donation. Yes, part 4 next time. Hopefully. I don't know what this week's gonna be. Anyway, that's all for today.